The Bible is full of images expressing themes that run right through the whole narrative. We need to examine each of these images closely. We need to see how they all connect us to the larger story. We need to read the images. When I first heard the Bible stories being read and people talking about them, and heard mention of the temple in Jerusalem, because I'd never been to Jerusalem or seen a map or diagram or whatever, I assumed that the temple was like a large church. I knew what churches looked like. They stood there on a city street and you'd go into them and there would be worship services and music and so on. The temple in Jerusalem wasn't like that. The temple in Jerusalem was a huge compound with the shrine at one point in that compound. And the temple was not just another large religious building, as though you might walk around Jerusalem and, oh, here's the temple. Actually, Jerusalem itself was a kind of extended temple. It was the holy city. It was basically a temple with a small community around it. And that's how temples in the ancient world worked. This was the whole point, that you would want to worship your God, whichever God that might be. And obviously for the Israelites, it's the Creator God, the God of Abraham, Yahweh. And so the temple becomes the focal point of the whole community, not just a bit of religion enshrined in one particular building. And the temple becomes, for all peoples in the ancient world, a place of sacrifice, a sense of having an obligation to the God, and so wanting to give God something which represents who you really are, a place of worship, a place of community definition. We are the people who worship in this temple, and so on. And that's true, as I say, for temples around the ancient world in general, and certainly for the people of Israel as they went to Jerusalem. But where does that idea come from in the traditions of Israel? Because, as we know, to begin with, Abraham and his family were nomads. They didn't have a city. They were wandering from place to place. But already in the stories of Abraham, we find that Abraham would build an altar to the Lord in a particular place and worship there. It's as though everywhere he went, he wanted to sanctify that place. He wanted to be able to show the God who had called him to leave his ancestral home and come to this new place. He wanted this to be the reality at the heart of his life. And so as we read the story of Genesis, moving towards the call of Abraham in Genesis 12, we find, as we saw in a previous section, creation itself seen as a temple, a heaven plus earth reality with an image at its heart, in this case, genuine human beings. The problem was that the humans failed in their task of reflecting God into the world and the world back to God. They tried to use bits of the world in order to aggrandize themselves, in order to get what they might want. So what was God going to do? Was he going to say, well, that's an end of that then? The story of Noah and the flood indicates that that was an option that God could have taken. But God is faithful to his creation. And so, despite human sin and failure and folly, God makes a way of demonstrating that judgment was indeed a possibility, but rescuing humans through and from that judgment. And indeed, the story of Noah's Ark, as scholars who have studied the ancient Near Eastern world have told us, is in a sense a temple story in itself. Here is this little ark, this little gift of God floating on the waters, carrying the people who are then going to restart the image-bearing vocation. And so we then get, after the Tower of Babel, which we'll come to in another section, we get the call of Abraham, and he goes about worshipping God from place to place. We get Isaac, his son. We get Jacob, Isaac's son. And then, astonishingly, when Jacob is running away from his brother Esau, having cheated him out of his birthright, suddenly there is another temple image, Jacob's ladder, joining heaven and earth, with angels going up and down on it. And in Jacob's dream, as he sees this ladder, God is making promises to him about the fact that he's going to come back to this land and worship him, the true God, in this place. And so these temple images point forwards, and anyone reading Genesis without knowing where the story was going might be puzzled by this. But it looks as though from the beginning, the call of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was the call to be people in whose midst God would come to dwell. How on earth was that going to be possible? Granted that they were a deeply dysfunctional family, as we see throughout Genesis, and indeed in various ways out beyond that. Well, God allowed them to be enslaved in Egypt, and then he rescued them. They needed to know that they were the people who were rescued by God. And then God took them to Mount Sinai and gave them the law, because they needed to be shaped and prepared. And the climax of the book of Exodus really reflects right back to the beginning of Genesis 1, because the climax of the book of Exodus is the construction of the tabernacle, which is a small working model of the new creation which God is going to make. The decoration of the tabernacle speaks of creation, and the function of the tabernacle is that there Israel is going to be gathered to worship God and strengthened to be his people in all sorts of ways. Of course, that too is shot through with mistakes and folly as Israel goes its own way. But the truth is that God himself comes to live in the midst of his people in the tabernacle. And that is the primary biblical narrative, not about how we humans could get up to God, but about how the true God comes to dwell with us. It's fascinating as the story goes on, because the people enter the promised land. God enables them to do that. God is with them. And the shrine, which is the tabernacle still as a portable tent, the shrine goes with them. And they have in the shrine, they have the Ark of the Covenant, the box containing the Ten Commandments and the other bits and pieces which symbolize God's agreement with his people. And early on in the book we call 1 Samuel, there's a terrible moment when they have forgotten completely who they're supposed to be as God's people, and the Philistines are attacking them. So somebody has the bright idea, let's get the Ark of the Covenant and take that down to battle, and then we'll win because our God will see us through. Well, you can't use God's living presence in that way. It's just an abuse. And so they lose the battle and the Philistines capture the ark. But fascinatingly, in terms of how God's presence works, even when that has been abused and misunderstood and treated just as a kind of cheap trick, it still carries power. And the Philistine gods and then the Philistine people have to bow before it. And eventually they send the ark back. And the ark arrives back eventually. And David then, when he becomes king, decides he wants to build a house, a fixed temple for the ark of God, a place that will replicate what was true of the tabernacle in the wilderness, only now be as a permanent location, which is both a good and a bad thing, as we see, because trying to keep God in one place is never entirely a good idea. But so David plans the temple, Solomon builds it. That's part of the ideology of the Israelite temple, is that it's the king who is the temple builder. But again, that can become something which people can misuse. Jeremiah in chapter 7 has to warn against people who are saying, oh, we've got the temple of the Lord, we've got the temple of the Lord. In other words, however we live, however we order our lives, whether we are worshipping God in holiness and truth, we're going to be okay because we've got the temple of the Lord. And the book of the prophet Jeremiah is how God is going to smash that temple and going to destroy it and going to allow the Babylonians to take it over and ruin it. And so the people go into exile. And the exile is one of the most formative moments, 70 years plus, in the whole story of the Old Testament. And it's a puzzle. Where is God? What's happened to his promise to be with us in person? And so during the exile, various prophets promise that Yahweh will return and the temple will be rebuilt. Ezekiel has a glorious picture of the rebuilt temple and of God coming to dwell there, like in the tabernacle in the wilderness. Isaiah chapter 40 talks about the glory of the Lord being revealed at last, and all flesh shall see it together. But the fascinating thing is, throughout the long years following the return of some of the Judeans from the Babylonian exile, before the time of Jesus, nobody ever said that that had happened until at last, when Jesus came, Jesus did things, said things, lived in a certain way, taught certain truths, which led the eye up to the fact that he was the temple in person. He was, as Matthew says, the Emmanuel, God with us. So when he arrives in Jerusalem, the place simply isn't big enough for him and the temple together, and he denounces it because of the failure of the Judean people yet one more time to reflect the true God into the world. He says, if only you'd known the way of peace, which I've been announcing in my kingdom prophecy, but now you've rejected it, and so the temple is going to be destroyed, and alas, you with it. But then, as in the prophecies of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Malachi, when Jesus comes to the temple and then does what he does there, and when he then launches his new temple movement, not least in the Last Supper, which again we'll come back to later on, Jesus' death and resurrection constitute his followers as the new temple, as the place where the living God is now going to dwell on earth. So that Paul can write in Ephesians chapter 2 that you are now the living temple because God dwells in your midst by his Holy Spirit. And so this theme of the church as the new temple isn't just a miscellaneous illustration, as many people have imagined. It harks back to that whole biblical theme. This was God's promise to dwell in the midst of his people so that his love and wisdom would be reflected out into the world. That is the call that we have in following Jesus and in being given the gift of his Spirit to do in and through us what the tabernacling presence of God had done in the wilderness and in Jerusalem. Now, of course, at the end of the book of Revelation, there is no temple in the new creation, the new heavens and the new earth, because God himself is there, and the Lamb, that is Jesus, is there, so that everything that the temple was in terms of a forward-looking signpost is now at last fulfilled. That's how this great biblical theme all fits together.